Welcome back. This next story was written in the Sexy Space Babes by Bluefish Cake universe, link below. It's called Going Native, written by Uncle Ceiling. Going Native, Chapter 1. The planet hung outside the window, blue and huge, swirls of white clouds covering the brown and green of land masses. The space station itself was in a fairly low orbit, and from his vantage point eyeing Elbruck could easily see the day-night Terminator and the brilliant flecks of light marking where cities dotted the landscape, all connected within trails like a great web. It would be beautiful if he wasn't so tired. Tired and bored. It had been 2 years since his wife was transferred to this bizarre backwater of a world, 2 years of wondering what she might have been up to, if she was safe, how well she could manage these bizarre human creatures. He had heard the stories, of course. Men who acted like women, were just as randy as women, and were some sort of phenomenal lovers. The humans had been the talk of shill society, never drifting completely out of the public eye in the 6 years they had been brought into the Empire. Rumors abounded. Ian did trust his wife, of course. He knew Marion would do her best to be safe, even if she did tend to be more than a little absent-minded. He trusted her, but he also knew that she was the kind of shill who could get in over her head without realizing it. That laser focus that made her great at her job also tended to leave her neglecting everything else. It could, and did, cause issues with astonishing regularity. That was, when you boiled everything down to the basics, why he was coming. According to reports, the large-scale insurrections on Earth had been cleared out, and what few petty acts occurred were symbolic more than anything. It was finally safe enough for Marion to consent to letting her husband come and help manage home for her. He was glad to be able to see her again. They had been separated by Mara's posting not long after their marriage, and he was getting sick of sitting around, trying to manage other potential suitors without even his primary wife around for company. Now here he was, moved halfway across a galaxy and stuck on a space station waiting for a transport shuttle to take him the last 500 kilometers down to the base and his new home. It could be hours yet, and he had nothing to do but stand around and get ogled by every soldier who passed by. Ian sighed, then turned on the front-facing camera on his small tablet to use as a mirror. He made sure his hair was coiffed perfectly, then took a small handkerchief out of a pocket and used it to buff the engraved silver band on his right tusk. He had always wanted to wear more accessories, but Marion thought they looked tacky. He hadn't really indulged himself until after she shipped out, and by now he was so used to how he looked with the tusk band and its thin chain connecting to the matching ear cuff that she was just going to have to adjust. Maybe he could convince her to get a matching set. She was going to owe him big after he was done fixing whatever mess her apartment was probably in after 2 years without a man's touch. He was of average build for a Shilvati male, fairly lean but with supple curves to his hips and a smooth round face. His skin was pale, partially genetics and partially from a lack of time outdoors. In her last message, Marion had said the humans call the color lilac after a particular flower. The pictures she had sent seemed nice. He sat his tablet down and straightened his clothes, pulling his shirt down and giving it a quick flick to sort out any wrinkles. The slacks and shirt were precisely cut, and the jacket he wore stopped just past his midriff. Ian liked to keep tidy, and the poorly fitting military jumpsuits being worn by the people around him just served to accentuate the contrast. Those jumpsuits weren't even tailored. Needing to get some blood pumping, Ian decided to wander a little around the staging area, catching the occasional snippet of conversation and often a long glance. Seeing a man was rare enough, but a civilian male all by himself on an ostensibly military space station was unlikely enough to border on impossible. He politely ignored the catcalls until he overheard something that made him stop.
Undocking in an hour. You have half that to get everything stowed and get checks done. I want to be landed at base 16 before dinner. If we miss the window, it will be hours before we get a new approach vector that fits our fuel budget.
Base 16. Ian grinned to himself and ran his hand through his hair to make sure it had just the right amount of bounce. He had a plan. Convincing the captain of the shuttle to bring him aboard was surprisingly easy. He barely even needed to flirt. Once they understood that he was stuck up on the station with nothing to do while he waited for his assigned ride, the captain and crew were more than happy to have him ride along. Some quick math told him that they would save him 8 or 9 hours of waiting, and the only downside would be that he would get planetside long before his luggage would. Well, that and having to be the only male around a group of thirsty-looking soldiers who were also taking the trip down. After what felt like an eternity of sitting awkwardly with the soldiers in the cargo area of the shuttle, trying and failing to make small talk, the captain took pity on him and offered Ian the co-pilot's seat. She didn't have a co-pilot assigned for this simple gravity well drop, and he would be much more comfortable in an adjustable pilot's couch over a hard plastic jump seat. He took to it gratefully and even surprised the captain by letting her know that he was a licensed pilot, civilian only, class 2, and might actually be useful. She seemed impressed, though Ian was pretty sure she was happier to know that he knew what not to touch over her being actually interested in his pilot certifications. It at least gave them something to talk about that wasn't as awkward as the same 10 questions about his love life. The shuttle had just undocked and barely started moving when everything went very, very wrong. The man had taken to watching the sky when there wasn't much to do. Even as cold as it was, if he bundled up he could stand to be out for quite a while sipping some broth and watching the lights dance. He had first noticed the lights 5 or 6 years earlier. Stace had never been much of an astronomer and had no way to make a telescope, but even a layman could notice when there are suddenly a lot more moving satellites than there used to be. He had wondered idly if there had been a boom in space exploration, but figured it was more likely that some idiots finally decided to put their military in space. He had never really considered aliens as being a possibility. After all, what was worth coming here? As long as the troubles left him alone, it didn't matter. He just knew that, in the evening twilight, they really were beautiful. A streak of light caught his attention. Something was falling from the sky, far slower than a meteor and trailing smoke and debris. Whatever it was, the thing was close and getting closer. When it finally got too low for him to see below the ridge to the south, Stace started counting. After half a minute or so, he faintly heard the impact. With a quick nod, he grabbed some gear, threw it all in his canoe, and started rowing. The river would get him close to the impact site and his curiosity had truly been piqued. Maybe now Stace would have some answers to his idle questions about what exactly was going on in the night sky. Ian felt like he was choking, then realized he definitely was. He had neglected to adjust the safety restraints on the copilot seat properly and now one of the shoulder straps was pulling his neck to the back of the chair. With a stiff gasp, he released the webbing and blearily tried to reassemble the pieces of what just happened into his mind. The shuttle had unlatched and begun to drift back from the station when everything had gone white. The craft lurched and shuddered as it was pushed down towards the planet by the explosion. It was pelted by debris while the pilot tried desperately to somehow gain control of the stricken and dying vehicle. Ian remembered a few other things, but it seemed to be blurry. Then nothing. The young man began to take stock of his situation. First, he looked over at the pilot, then glanced away quickly. She was definitely dead. No need to dwell on it during a crisis. Time to panic later. The entire cockpit was a mess and some of his breathing trouble seemed to be not from strangulation but from the acrid bluish smoke that was coming from the control panel. The front canopy was crazed with cracks and on the other side of it, he could see what appeared to be a rock face and some trees, all covered with snow. Ian realized that if he stayed in the cockpit, he would soon die. The bulkhead that separated the cockpit from the body of the shuttle was sealed and far too heavy for him to open without power, but there was a small emergency door to the outside that might get him free. Ian heaved and pushed with as much strength as his small body could give him and the door cracked open a few scant centimeters before getting stuck. He pushed again, then pounded on it with his fists. It wasn't going to move another iota. He was going to die here on this miserable planet stuck in a crashed shuttle with a dead body in a room full of toxic smoke. Now was the time to panic. A banging on the outside of the door drew Ian out of his head and back to reality. Someone was trying to open it from the outside. Maybe one of the soldiers had survived. A piece of blackened metal slammed into the gap, then began to lever it open. The face that peered through was not the large, purple face of a Shilvari Sodder. It was level with his and dark hair covered his pinkish tan cheeks and chin. The eyes had strange white scleras and there were no tusks at the edges of his red lips. The face was accompanied by a blast of cold air as the human tore the door open another few centimeters. He was using a piece of twisted wreckage as a lever, forcing it in deeper and letting out a low grunt as he managed to get the door open enough for a human, or a Shilvari male, to squeeze through. Ian froze in a panic as the human held out a hand. Stace tried to keep himself calm and outwardly friendly, but his mind was racing. The alien, and he was sure it was an alien, was standing there in its crashed ship. The creature was shorter than Stace, probably about 5.5 feet tall, with small tusks poking out through either side of its full lips. The sclera of its eyes were black as ink, with golden irises that gave the impression of metallic discs floating in a pool of oil. The creature had skin of an unusual shade, perhaps light purple, but it was hard to tell among the smoke and the dying light of the setting sun. All in all, Stace was given an impression of vulnerability. It was easy to see that the alien was terrified. In that sort of situation, there wasn't a choice. Stace was compelled to help. When he had seen the fireball coming down, Stace had hoped it would be some interesting space debris but did not expect a manned craft, survivors, or aliens. When he had noticed that the rear of the craft was on fire and someone was trying to escape the front, his natural helpful autopilot kicked in and he managed to force the door open. Now he had to somehow convince whatever was in the cockpit that he was safe, and it was definitely safer than being inside the burning craft. For all he knew, this was first contact with an alien and he wasn't going to bungle it by letting the thing die. Stace backed carefully out of the gap and swung his arm out, trying to indicate by gesture that the path led outside.
"Come out of there,"
he said, then realized the whole thing was stupid. The door was open, the alien could get out whenever it wanted. There was more work to be done. Stace had taken a long look at the craft before he noticed the side door trying to open. It wasn't particularly large, perhaps the size of a C-17 but with small stubby wings. Huge for an airplane, but small for what he thought of as a spaceship. The whole thing was boxy and made of a metal with a slight purple sheen. He could see a large rent in the side about midway down the craft with smoke pouring out. A quick peek into what he now was pretty sure was the cockpit area had shown Stace that the two areas were separate. He took a rather ragged-looking handkerchief from his pocket, wrapped it around his nose and mouth, held a deep breath, and ran into the hole towards the rear of the shuttle. Aang didn't wait long after the human left to pull his way out of the cabin. 1, then 2 steps outside and he was breathing clean air. Almost immediately, he began to cough. The air was freezing cold, colder than he had ever felt before. He tried to catch his breath and ignore the sting in his throat as he looked around. The area around the crash site was churned earth and bare dirt surrounded by heaps of white snow and steaming mud where the heat of the craft had managed to make a tiny change to the local climate. Not far from the clearing was a line of trees, all covered in white. To his right, he could see a rock escarpment, tall enough to cut off his view and dotted with more snow where it collected in the cracks and crevices. He could see no vehicles. He was sure there would be a truck, a hovercraft, a shuttle, something. The fact that someone else was here meant that they had to have gotten here somehow, but there was nothing. In fact, even the human was gone. For a moment he felt truly and deeply alone, but the feeling didn't last long. He realized there was a new source of cold on his ear and reached up to unclip his ear cuff, slide off his tusk ring, and securely put them both in a shirt pocket. Then he started the universally known process of patting every pocket on his body to try to find his data pad. If he could get a line to someone, he would just have to manage to stay warm until rescue arrived. Aang's pat-down was interrupted by a sound of coughing coming from a large tear in the main cargo area of the shuttle. He turned just in time to see the human attempting to pull a body out of the wreck. Aang ran up and grabbed the large shoulder so the two of them could pull the unconscious woman free. Once she was clear, Aang and the human stood there, side by side, heaving out loud breaths as they looked at the soldier. She was taller than average and by sheer body mass alone she easily matched both of the males, but lying in the snow she looked vulnerable, her skin unnaturally pale with soot and dirt accenting the sharp features of her face. She had a bleeding wound in the side of her abdomen and the white fog of her breath was weak. If she had been wearing armor she would have been fine, but there was no reason to wear armor on a trip from a space station to a military base on an occupied and presumably docile planet. There wasn't anything that could go wrong. Aang felt the clinical detachment of shock setting in as he realized that there was a very good chance that he would end up watching the woman die. He barely turned as the human patted him roughly on the shoulder and ran back into the ship. It was hot in the ship and Stace was sure that if he got a lungful of whatever crap was filling the chamber he would probably never make it back out. He tried to mitigate it by counting in his head as he crouched low.
1,000. 2 1,000.
On 6 1,000 he found a duffel bag, a bit charred and battered but still together. It was oversized enough that he was able to throw the straps over his shoulder and settle it onto his back. On 9 1,000 he thought he found another one of the gigantic aliens only to realize that almost everything above the armpits was crushed by a large crate of some kind. On 12 1,000, Stace's lungs were screaming and he turned to run out only to be stopped by a symbol he recognized on the closest of several identical crates. It was a very regular-looking human sticker he had seen hundreds of times, plastered slightly crookedly on the side of the box. It was a white diamond with a red border. In the middle, a black sphere was fragmenting apart, pieces going in all directions. Oh shit! The human came running back, yelling loudly. Aang couldn't understand the word explosives, but he could definitely recognize the gesture. The man held his hands together, then threw them apart in opposite directions while yelling.
Boom.
Then gestured to the woman and pointed to the edge of the clearing near the escarpment. The human didn't hesitate, just grabbed the woman by the shoulders, lifted with a grunt, and started dragging without waiting to see if Aang did anything to help. Of course, Aang had to help. His actions almost started before Aang had a chance to realize what he was doing. He felt dragged along on this course the human had set, a social inertia overcoming his shock so that he took the soldier's legs, lifted as best he could, and helped move her. When they had gone perhaps 50 meters, Ian almost stopped. He saw their goal was a pointed wooden boat pulled up on the shore of a small river that ran behind the rock face and into a cleft like a small canyon. He had never been on a boat in his life, hated the outdoors, and was already miserable with cold. Still, he wanted to survive, and maybe the human could give him that. He checked on the soldier while the human pulled bundles out of the boat. She seemed stable, but the size of the blood stain on her side was troubling. Finally the human pulled out a large animal skin of some kind and laid it in the bottom of the boat, then gestured to Ian for help again. The two managed to get the soldier into the boat with a mix of shoving, pulling, and some choice swearing in 2 languages, then covered her with another animal fur. The duffel bag was unceremoniously stuffed between her legs. The human pushed the boat farther into the water, then stood ankle deep and held it steady so Ian could get in. With the little wooden vehicle so overloaded, he had to push and slosh deeper into the water until it floated free and he could finally clamber in. After a quick glance to make sure everybody was secure, the human pulled a flattened piece of wood from a small rack and started to paddle them towards the safety of the escarpment. Ian found the whole thing disorienting as he sat on a little bench opposite the strange man, the unconscious soldier's head between his feet as he moved back first through the water. They had just made it around the rock face and clear of the ship itself when whatever was stored inside it detonated. Pebbles and larger rocks were shaken free of the escarpment by the blast, their splashing making the craft sway and rock before a large wave propagating from the shore near the blast site nearly tipped them over. While the human managed to recover the boat and stop it from capsizing, Ian was thrown off balance and felt his chest constrict in shock as his body plunged into the frigid water. End of chapter. If you enjoyed, like, subscribe, and visit the author, and I'll see you next time. If you didn't, comment on what I can do better. And as usual, have a wonderful day.